Chapter 3. The Benefits of Living Up to Your Gloss. The support course, huh? Shinju said, looking up at the light filtering down through the leaves of their lunchtime tree. Izuku nodded excitedly, his lunch laying untouched as he flipped through Volume 11 notebook. It was the one with the most recent observations and analysis of Eraserhead, and Izuku was eager to get feedback on it. Mike had cornered him after school yesterday, after Night Eye's visit, to ask if he had any more analysis notebooks that he was willing to share, and Izuku had agreed to bring in more tomorrow. Notebooks 7 through 10, as well as 12, were stacked neatly beside him, waiting for the opportunity to be handed off. He really seems to think I could do it, Izuku told him, eyes flicking between lines as he looked for errors or places that analysis could be fine-tuned in a hurry. Of course you could do it, Shinju said, somewhat muffled with his mouth full, then swallowed. That wasn't the question. Izuku looked up, giving Shinju a puzzled look. What's the question then? The question is whether or not you want to do that, Shinju said seriously. You'd be working with that maniac, and if you did this professionally, you don't think he's the only maniac you'd have to deal with. Your job would be telling heroes they're not good enough, and I'm not saying that you don't have the courage for it, but it's something to consider. Izuku considered this for a moment, letting his eyes fall back to his notebook. He'd managed to get through a whole week and a half without crying in front of Shinju, and he didn't want to break that streak now. Still, he felt his eyes prickling with tears, and he blinked rapidly to avoid having to wipe them away. I can't be a hero, he said at last. It's not in the stars for me, but I always wanted to be useful to someone in some way, and if this is the way I can do that, then I can't turn it down. I just don't want to be Deku anymore. Shinzu was quiet for a moment, letting Izuku dash at his eyes with his sleeve without comment. When he spoke, his voice was soft, and it made Izuku look up at the gentleness of it. I think you can do anything you put your mind to, Mito, he said quietly. If this is what you want, and you think it will make you happy, then I'm all for it. You deserve that much. Thanks, Izuku said, his eyes feeling watery again as he looked at his best friend. Hey, Gen Ed boys, came a loud feminine voice from somewhere behind Izuku. He whirled around to see a girl with salmon pink hair and wide, intense eyes, a pair of goggles perched atop her head. Instead of a uniform, she wore a pair of baggy pants and a black tank top, with a jacket tied around her waist. Looking for all the world like she'd just come from a machine shop. She was carrying a lunch tray balanced in one hand, and waving animatedly with the other as she approached the two of them, a grin threatening to split her face in half. Izuku and Shinzu looked at each other, eyes wide and confused. Shinzu raised an eyebrow, darting his eyes to the newcomer, and then back at Izuku. Izuku shook his head. He had no idea who she was. Hi? Izuku said, as she reached the spot where the two of them were sat in the grass and flopped down, apparently uncaring of the way it made her dishes rattle. Hiya, said the girl, grabbing the bowl of rice and fixing her piercing gaze on Izuku. I'm Mei Hatsume, from the support course. You're Midoriya, right? Yes, Izuku asked, then cleared his throat when it came out sounding like a question. That's me. You're the one Sensei was talking about, Hatsume continued as she shoveled rice into her mouth. You're going to transfer to the support course for analyst. Izuku went red and sputtered for a moment, but before he could recover himself, Shinzu laughed. What do you know, he said, elbowing Izuku. You don't even have to ask about a transfer. They're already shoving you at the support course teachers. Really? Izuku finally managed, not sure what else he was supposed to say. Yep, Hatsume said, cheerfully. I heard the teachers talking about it. Usually the analyst types go to the business course, so having one that wants to do support work is kind of a big deal. It is? Izuku flailed, nearly knocking over his water bottle as he tried to reorientate himself. I mean, it can't be that big of a deal, right? Market analysis and hero analysis are two totally different things. Surely there can't be much overlap in that the business course takes up all the people like me. Well, yeah, Hatsume shrugged, but people who study things like quirks and fighting styles usually go into pro-heroics themselves, so we don't get a lot of them in support course. Oh, Izuku said, feeling suddenly dejected. Hatsume and Shinzu were looking at him, though, so he hitched a smile back in place and nodded. Well, you don't have to worry about me. I don't have a quirk, so I'm not exactly hero material. Excellent, Hatsume said excitedly, pumping a fist clutched around her chopsticks into the air. You can tell me what kind of support gear is most needed in the industry. What kind of technology should I be focusing on developing? What do heroes really need? Izuku knew his mouth was slightly open, but he couldn't help it. He had just told a new person, a person who went to UA high school, that he didn't have a quirk, and nothing bad had happened. She hadn't laughed at him, or grown suddenly cold, or attacked him outright. She still thought he was someone worth talking to, even without a quirk. He didn't need to be as strong as Kachan to be her friend. Just like that, the answer to her question rose nearly unbidden in his mind, and he answered her with almost equal enthusiasm. A section of the hero industry that could really use more support items is underground heroes, he explained as Hatsume listened with rapt attention. They tend to have less physical quirks, so they don't really need much help to control or take advantage of them. What they need is weapons that suit their environment and a fighting style. They can't use the same kind of weapons that spotlight heroes use, because spotlight heroes need to be flashy, but underground heroes can't afford that. Take Eraserhead, for example. He doesn't need much but a pair of goggles for using his quirk, but he based his entire fighting style around his capture weapon. What they need are simple, efficient, versatile weapons that aren't designed to draw attention. Hatsume nodded, her eyes cast downwards as she thought. Simple, efficient, versatile, she repeated. Then suddenly she raised her eyes back at Izuku's face, giving him an almost maniacal smile. I can do that, she exclaimed, then winked. I think you and I are going to be great friends. Before Izuku could respond to that, he suddenly felt a hand wrap around his upper arm, and he was tugged gently to lean towards Shinzu. Hey, Shinzu said grumpily. Mido's my friend. Get your own. It's okay, Shin-chan, Izuku insisted, even as he saw Hatsume stick her tongue out at Shinzu out of the corner of his eye. We'll still get to work together when you get into the hero course. I've got to let your old friend here make some new friends, Hatsume concurred. High school is a fresh start, after all. Shinzu and Izuku both blinked at her. We're not old friends, Shinzu said. We met last week, on the first day of school. Now it was Hatsume's turn to blink in confusion. You just met? She repeated. But you're so familiar with each other. Izuku felt himself blushing again. He glanced at Shinzu, to find him smiling his slightly mean smile he used when he first met. Izuku quickly picked up his chopsticks and pretended to be interested in eating, but Shinzu was setting his things aside. We aren't old friends, Shinzu began. But someone Mido went to middle school with did get into the hero course. He's a real piece of work, too. I walked in on him about to blow Mido sky high with his flashy explosion quirk. Mido called him Kachan, though, so I said it was weird that he used such an affectionate name with someone who bullied him. He wasn't always like that, Izuku said into his lunch. Maybe not, Shinzu poked at Izuku's chest. But you gotta admit, trying to pass yourself as affectionate person was a pretty dumb move. So that's how he ended up calling you Shin-chan, Hatsume concluded, grinning a shark-like grin. Shinzu gave him a little huff of amusement. After that, it was weird calling him Midoriya, so I went with Mido. Hatsume threw her head back and laughed, long and loud, full of genuine mirth. You guys are a riot, she said, wiping her eyes with one finger. We're gonna have so much fun this year. Shinju gave a slightly creepy little giggle, and Izuku couldn't help but laugh himself. High school was nothing like he imagined. Even with Kachan still here, potentially lurking around any corner, it was much better than middle school. He thought if it meant that he got to have friends like Shinzu and Hatsume, he would gladly have dealt with Kachan every day for the rest of his life. Izuku handed off his hero analysis notebooks to President Mike at the end of the day. He was still a little bit nervous about some of the earlier work, but Mike went straight for the notebook 7 and began flipping through it before Izuku had the chance to escape. Having not yet been dismissed, Izuku held his ground, but Mike had, again, said that his analysis had been very insightful, and taken all of the offered notebooks to look through and potentially show around. The next day, at lunch, Hatsume again joined him and Shinzo. Already a few rough ideas drawn on bits of paper that didn't look like this was their intended purpose. She talked animatedly about the potential inventions, or babies as she called them, and Shinzo looked interestedly at the couple. He had yet to start training with weapons, and finding a particular weapon to be his signature had always been the plan. Izuku offered his opinion on the ones Shinzo was interested in, how well they would fit into his fighting style he would need to develop, and Hatsume promised to think more about how she could create the ones they had agreed on. They had all just settled into actually eating what was left on their lunch, rather than nibbling on it as they worked, when a shadow fell across the little gathering. It came from behind Izuku, so he was able to see the stunned looks on Shinzo and Hatsume's faces before he turned around. "Kami Woods," Izuku squeaked, looking wide-eyed up at the hero standing over him. Kami Woods looked down at him. "Midoriya, right?" he said as Izuku hurried to turn himself around on the grass to look directly up at him. "You got caught in the sludge villain incident, didn't you? Made a lot of trouble with that stunt you pulled." "Yes, sir." Izuku looked away but didn't lower his face. It would be too awkward to look down when the hero he was speaking to was too far above him. "You're the one with the notebooks, aren't you?" Kami said. He didn't sound particularly impressed. Izuku swallowed. "Yes, sir," he repeated, wondering if this was the part where those notebooks finally got him in trouble. "I saw what you wrote about me," said Kami. His expression was unreadable behind his wooden mask, but his tone wasn't exactly friendly. "You've got a lot to say about heroes who risk their lives for you every day." "I didn't mean anything by it," Izuku said hurriedly, shaking his head wildly back and forth. "Those notebooks were just supposed to be for me, just to help me understand heroes better, and then—" "You've got something to say about it," came Shinzu's voice, cutting off Izuku's rambled apologies. Izuku swiveled to look at Shinzo, trying to make his eyes wide and pleading, but Shinzo was looking up at Kami with a look of bored distaste. "Most of the heroes who work here think Mito's analysis is pretty helpful," Shinzo went on, even as Izuku began to shake his head slightly. "You think you're too good to take a little criticism." Izuku turned slowly to look back at Kami. He knew his expression must be terrified. He felt like he was on the verge of tears, and he could barely bring himself to make eye contact with the hero. The sun was behind Kami, shining in Izuku's eyes, but he wouldn't disrespect the hero by looking away. Then, quite unexpectedly, Kami sighed. "Nah," he said, his posture relaxing into a somewhat easier stance. "Those analyses were exactly the kick in the pants some of the guys needed, and anything that gives me an edge is welcome." He shrugged nonchalantly, and Izuku could have sworn his soul left his body at the degree of relief that came over him. "I do have a question for you, though," Kami continued when Izuku didn't respond. "You mentioned incorporating leaves into my fighting style, but I'm curious about how much you actually know what you're asking." "Huh?" Izuku made a small exhalation of confusion, then drew a breath and managed to ask, "What do you mean?" "I can grow leaves," Kami informed him, extending one finger into an elongated twig and growing a single bright green leaf to dangle from it. "However, I can't control them as precisely as the branches, and they're far more delicate. I discarded the idea of using them in combat while I was at school." Izuku was itching to get out his current notebook and start taking notes, but he clamped down the instinct. "They can still be useful, though," he insisted, trying to sound like he was gushing rather than criticizing. "They can obscure your opponent's vision and limit their movements. A path blocked by branches is difficult to pass through, but a path blocked by branches and also obscured by leaves, you might as well put up a concrete wall." "They also make it difficult for me to see," Kami countered, and then lowered his voice and muttered, "and for the cameras to see me." Shinzo coughed in somewhere behind, sounding like he was using the sound to hide a snort of laughter. A second later, he grunted, and if Izuku had to hazard a guess, he'd say Hatsume had poked him in the ribs. "Not necessarily," Izuku said, tactfully ignoring the second part of the hero's statement. If you concentrate them specifically in the path of the villain and leave your other branches clear, you can get a good sense of where they are without them being able to see what you're doing. Plus, any leaves that fall on the ground are sure to become valued souvenirs. Kami said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. His imagination clearly caught on the idea of his leaves becoming collector's items. And then he looked back at Izuku. You talk of big game, little man, but how much do you really know about what you're talking about? Have you ever been in a real fight? Besides the one All Might bailed you out of, I mean. Izuku swallowed, wondering which answer would be preferable. He quickly settled on the truth. Yes, sir, he said. I have, but it's never been much of a fight. Kami looked down at him for another moment, and then said, Spar with me. Huh? Said Izuku. What? Said Hatsume. No way, said Shinzo. No quirks, Kami clarified, holding up both hands. Nothing serious, just a friendly little bout, just to see how good your instincts are. Izuku's brain stalled, trying to think of a reason to refuse. He was sure whatever reason he gave Shinzo and Hatsume would back him up, but nothing came to his mind. Sure? Kami backed up several paces, and Izuku stood on shaky legs to take up position opposite him. He glanced only once at Shinzo and Hatsume, who had adjusted themselves for a better view of the fight. Hatsume looked curious but worried, still eating but chewing slowly and thoughtfully. Shinzo, on the other hand, had set the food aside, and he looked absolutely furious as he glared at Kami. He did not seem to trust that the hero had only a friendly spar in mind. At least it won't be as bad as fighting Kacchan, Izuku thought, nervously. But that was all he had time for before Kami attacked. Izuku blocked his first swing on instinct, a big right hook like Kacchan's usual opener. The next swing came from the other hand, and this time he ducked, bending his knees until he was level with the gap between the hero's legs. Immediately he dived forward, seeing an escape route as well as a way to put his opponent off balance, and he managed to make it through the opening before he was grabbed. He popped back on his feet, but instead of running away he turned, to see Kami stumbling as he tried to right himself, or whirled around at the same time. Come on, short stack. Hatsume's voice reached his ears, but he didn't turn towards the noise. Get him, Mito, came Shinzo at the same time. Deciding if he was going to do this, he might as well do it. Izuku aimed a kick at Kami's back, sending him lurching forward a few steps. Izuku went running after him, hoping to stay behind him for as long as possible, but before he could do anything else, the hero was turning and thrusting out an arm towards him. For a second, Izuku wondered what he was doing, as he was still too far away to land a hit. Then suddenly branches exploded from out of his forearm. In the space between 1 second and another, Izuku's mind raced through everything he knew about Kami Woods. He watched 17 fights in which the hero had participated, including the ones he'd seen on YouTube or on the news. He'd watched 22 villains fall before him. 3 villains, however, had gotten away. 2 of them, on 2 different days, had used one move. Page 57, Izuku thought, and jumped. He landed standing atop the thick, stable trunk with a wooden thump, and before he could destabilize or fall, he channeled his wobbling into forward motion and went running down the branch toward Kami. Kami, for his part, had clearly not been expecting that, and when Izuku reached him, he could do nothing but close his eyes against the kick Izuku aimed at his teeth. A painful jolt went through Izuku's toe as his worn sneakers connected with solid wood, and a moment later he was lifted off his feet, tangled helplessly in branches growing from the hero's other hand. Kami stopped, steady on his feet once more, but breathing hard as though in pain. Izuku wriggled a little, trying to free himself, but he was firmly caught and wouldn't be going anywhere, until he was let go. The two of them looked at each other blankly, neither quite sure where to go from here. Hey, Shinzu's voice drew Izuku's attention, and he turned to see his friend standing and making purposefully for the hero who had pinned him. I thought you said no quirks? What do you call that? Sorry, Kami said, beginning to take back his twigs and branches from around Izuku. Reflexes, you understand. Of course, Izuku assured him, as he was deposited back to his feet on the ground. This kind of illustrates my point, though, about using leave to obscure your opponent's vision. I suppose, Kami said, still looking a little dazed. Shinzo, who did not look at all like he understood about reflexes or intended to drop the subject of quirk use, opened his mouth to continue his earlier expressions of outrage. Before he could say anything, however, another voice rang out from across the lawn. "What are you doing here?" Eraserhead demanded, marching towards them angrily, determined stride. Kami backed away from Izuku, hands held up at the level of his shoulders and making downwards motions towards Eraser. "Take it easy," he said. "Can't you hero visit a hero school to chat with some students?" "We've already had one security breach this week. The perimeter was supposed to be tightened," Eraser said, crossing his arms over his chest as he came to stand before Kami. "And those aren't hero students you're chatting with." "You could have fooled me," Kami said, cracking his neck and throwing a wary glance at Izuku. "I asked if I could come talk to Midoriya, and I have permission to be here." Eraser's eyes narrowed. "And what does a hero want with a Gen Ed student?" "The kid's a hell of an analyst," Akami explained, making Izuku glow with a now familiar pride. "He's got pretty good kinetic awareness, too, and a fighter's instincts." At this revelation, Eraser paused, giving Izuku a moment to process it himself. He thought about fighting, obviously. He's analyzed enough heroes' fighting styles to know what would work for a quirkless person and what wouldn't. All the training he had done had been in a vacuum, though, with no one who knew what they were talking about to tell him what he was doing. Was it possible he had advanced that much? Shinzo, who had been looking between Eraser and Kami as each of them spoke, was apparently content to stay quiet no longer. "He used his quirk on Mito," he accused seriously, "after he said he wouldn't." "It's not a big deal," Izuku insisted quickly. "I was fine." Still not very heroic behavior, Hatsume piped up for the first time. "And you were unarmed." Kami's head whipped around, abandoning his standoff with Eraser to stare at Hatsume. "What do you mean he doesn't have a quirk?" the hero sputtered. "You considered him that much of a threat, huh?" Eraser asked. But he didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded almost contemplative. Shinzo looked about ready to explode with indignation, so Izuku took his friend by the arm. Shinzo flinched but didn't pull away, still glaring at Kami with fire in his eyes. Izuku, not sure what else to do, rubbed his hand over Shinzu's back. Eventually, Shinzo looked at him, still glaring, but his face softened when he saw Izuku. "Shin-chan," Izuku said quietly. Shinzo took a deep breath and then let it out in a great gust. Then he looked away, off to one side. "Whatever," he said. Eraser gave a weary little sigh. "The bell's about to ring for class," he said at last. "Take your dishes inside." "Yes, sir," Izuku said hurriedly, and began to drag Shinzo over to the abandoned tray. The three of them collected their things and headed back inside. It was only once they were several paces away that Izuku heard Eraser and Kami continue their conversation, but it was distant enough that he couldn't make out what they were saying. Hatsume shouted her goodbye over the crowd as she broke off from them to head to her own class, and Izuku and Shinzo made their way towards the Gen Ed wing. "That was weird," Shinzo said once they were safely back in their classroom. "Definitely," Izuku agreed. "Thank you, by the way." Shinzo gave him a confused look. "For what?" "For, Izuku fidgeted a little. "Sticking up for me. Getting mad when he thought he was being unfair to me." "Of course I was mad," Shinzo said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The guy came around just to make you uncomfortable and then tried to beat you up. You really showed him, though." "I don't think that's why he came," Izuku defended, even though Shinzu's words made him feel warm inside. Like being praised by heroes did. He wondered what exactly that feeling was. "And I didn't really show him much of anything, except maybe why he should use leaves." "Are you kidding?" Shinzo grinned. "You were amazing! I didn't know you could even fight like that. We definitely need to add more sparring matches to our training." Izuku opened his mouth to argue, but the teacher cleared his throat pointedly at the class, so he simply gave a nod. More sparring would be a good idea. Night Eye had come to talk to Izuku on Wednesday, and Kami Wood's visit was Friday lunch. So by Friday afternoon, Izuku thought he was justified in assuming that he was done with excitement for the week. They had nearly run into Kacchan on their way out of the building, but he was heading for one of the many gyms on the campus, so Izuku merely towed Shinzu in the opposite direction, and they managed to escape from Kacchan's notice. The part of Izuku that still worried about these things told him that Kacchan was in a bad mood. He didn't know why that would be, though, and it wasn't that different from Kacchan's default mood, so he put it from his mind. They had swiped their ID cards to get into the gym on the opposite side of campus from the one Kacchan was using, and as they entered, a cheerful voice chirped out how many hours they'd been logging working out. Izuku felt oddly pleased with how much time they'd spent training in only 2 weeks. They had agreed to use Izuku's strategic exercise regimen to train together on the first day of school, and even in this short amount of time, they'd managed to make real progress. He knew the hero students were probably doing more, given that they had class time to use, but he still felt like those logged hours were well spent. Thankfully, there were only 2 other students here, using the weight room for the moment, so Izuku and Shinzu changed into their gym clothes and set up shop on the main floor. Shinzu wanted to spar right away, but Izuku insisted that they at least do warm-ups first. They were just finishing that up, Shinzu eyeing the practice mats hungrily, when a voice interrupted Izuku's concentration. "Hey there, listeners," came Present Mike, causing Izuku and Shinzu to stumble to a stop when they were doing a quick few laps around the gym. They were very near the end of their 5th lap, and they had started by the door, so Mike was only a few paces in front of them. Izuku rested his hands on his knees for a moment. He was breathing hard, but beside him Shinzu was breathing harder, and he recovered first. "Hello, sir," Izuku said, standing straight and smiling brightly at Mike. Working out always made him feel like smiling. "What can we do for you?" "Midoriya, would you mind stepping out with me for a second?" Mike asked, after striking a suitably dramatic pose. "You're not in trouble, and I'll let you get back to your workout in no time." "Sure," Izuku said, glancing at Shinzu to make sure he was right with him. Shinzu, who was still catching his breath, gave a thumbs up. Izuku followed Mike out of the main gym and into the front hallway between the door and the rest of the rooms. He expected Mike to lead him outside, but Mike seemed content with this level of privacy, and he stopped there and turned to look at Izuku. He was still smiling in what suddenly struck Izuku in a theatrical manner, and the way he placed his hands was almost artful on his hips, somehow coming to a more casual, resolute, abruptly seeming studied. "Is this about my notebooks?" Izuku asked, not sure how to process that observation. "Your notebooks have become an overnight hit," Mike said, excitedly, but some of his usual energy bled out of him as he gave Izuku a concerned look. "I wanted to talk to you about that visitor you had today." "Kalmi Woods?" Izuku shook his head. "That wasn't really a big deal. He had permission to be here, he just wanted to talk to me about my analysis." "He did a little more than talk," Mike pointed out, still a bit on the quiet side. "I heard he challenged you to a sparring match." "Yeah, well," Izuku shrugged, not really sure how to excuse his behavior. "I didn't really know how to say no." "And a hero like him should have considered that," Mike said. His tone sounded disapproving, but his eyes were soft as he looked at Izuku. "I'm not sure I understand," Izuku admitted. "Was I supposed to—" "You weren't supposed to do anything," Mike assured him. "He was the one who should have considered the effect of his authority would have on you. A hero needs to remember that they have influence over others with what they say and how they act." "I see," said Izuku, though he did not see at all. Mike seemed to realize this before he struck another dramatic pose and shouted, "Take me, for instance. I've got the ear of the younger audience with my radio show, so I'm careful to send good vibes only to my listeners. They look up to me because I'm a hero, so I've got to set a good example for them." Izuku couldn't help but smile at Mike's antics, even suppressing a little giggle. Mike relaxed his pose, grinning at Izuku, and looked at him over the rims of his sunglasses. "I'm not surprised you got an in-person interview at all, though," he informed Izuku proudly. "You've done great work, and a lot of the heroes were very impressed with your analysis." "You're getting quite the reputation." Izuku shuffled from foot to foot, wondering if he was now the right time to bring this up. "Does that mean you think I should I ask if I can transfer to the support course?" For a moment, Mike just looked at him. He was still smiling, his posture still studiously relaxed, but he seemed to be contemplating his answer carefully. Izuku braced himself, wondering how he'd deal with any answer Mike might give. Then suddenly Mike was back in his full form, posing dramatically and giving Izuku double finger guns. "I think you should shoot for the top of the charts, little listener," he said boisterously. "Whatever you can think you can achieve, I say go for it." Izuku suddenly thought back to another conversation like this one, standing on a rooftop on the worst day of his life. Being told by All Might that his dreams were unrealistic hadn't felt good. That was what made him decide that the Gen Ed course would be the best he could hope for. Standing here now, with Present Might telling him to follow his dreams, that rooftop felt distant, unimportant nightmare. "Thank you," Izuku said. It seemed woefully inadequate. Mike's smile widened, but it didn't seem theatrical this time. In fact, it might have been the most genuine smile he'd ever seen Mike wear. "Anytime," Mike said, and Izuku couldn't help but smile back.